After 3 years of war, Ukraine is facing intense pressure from Donald Trump to reach a settlement with Russia. Trump has engaged directly with Russian President Vladimir Putin while calling Ukrainian President Zelenskyy a dictator. The truth is, his administration has sidelined European allies while joining a handful of Russian partners in voting against a UN resolution condemning Putin's aggression. But meanwhile, as the president of Ukraine, President Zelenskyy also took to social media. In addition to building the relationship with the US, he also posted regarding the relationship with Canada. He posted, and I quote, "I'm grateful to Canada for its leadership in supporting Ukrainians throughout the difficult 3 years, and to Justin Trudeau for organizing and hosting a productive G7 leaders meeting. Canada continued to support Ukraine by providing military equipment and strengthening our energy security." Well, at this moment, how do we understand the relationship between Ukraine and US at this moment? And what about Donald Trump? Is he actually the right person to finish the war? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. He is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and USSR, and on nationalism, revolutions, and he's the author of the book Imperial Ends, The Decay, Collapse, and the Revival of Empires. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, as I mentioned in the intro, now, the Ukraine is currently standing at the crossroads, and according to the report, Donald Trump and also his top aides are trying to even cajole or even threaten Zelenskyy into signing over half of Ukrainians' revenue from oil, gas, and other minerals, as well as earning from the port worth about $500 billion. Dr. Motyl, last time you and we had a conversation. Now, I would say things were developed slowly. But right now, again, over the past week, we've seen Donald Trump has been very active. But meanwhile, it is to believe that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is under tremendous pressure. And also, he claimed that he was willing to give up his presidency in order for the country to join the NATO. And that was not going to happen under Donald Trump's watch. Help us to understand what changed, and also what about the fate of the Ukraine right now? Your thoughts?
Well, the picture, as always, when it's a question of dealing with Donald Trump, is complicated. He has a tendency to change his mind in the course of one paragraph, sometimes even in one sentence. A week ago, the United States proposed a deal to Ukraine, and that entailed ostensibly a $500 billion debt that Ukraine was supposed to pay off. It meant that the United States would have access to 50% of all returns on other minerals. It was essentially a colonial deal. And Zelenskyy rejected it. And immediately after the rejection, Trump lost his temper. And at a press conference, he then denounced Zelenskyy as a, quote, dictator without election. And it looked as if things couldn't possibly get any worse in terms of U.S. relations with Ukraine. And then, magically, a few days ago, the United States and Ukraine came up with a new version of this deal, which is much fairer and much more equitable, and no longer has the colonial overtones of the first deal. There is no talk of a $500 billion debt. There's talk of an investment fund that would be shared, whose profits would be invested in Ukraine. There is even talk of security guarantees. That's not to say that the United States would provide them, but at least it recognizes the importance of security guarantees. And Zelenskyy is supposed to arrive in Washington today. I'm not exactly sure at what time. And he and Trump are supposed to sign this particular document. The document also talks about American support of Ukraine, of democracy, of sovereignty, of security, and things like that. So the document says all the right things. It's currently just a framework document because the details have yet to be elaborated upon in a subsequent document. But it's a far cry from the document that the Americans proposed a week ago. That was colonialist, as I said. This one is more or less an equitable, fair partnership. Now, of course, the devil is in the details, and we'll find out whether the two sides can agree to the details and what those details will be later on. But so far, so good. And yesterday at a press conference, Trump was asked, do you still think of Zelenskyy as a dictator? And he said, did I say that? I couldn't have said that. I don't remember saying that. So suddenly he's changed his mind. He rejects having ostensibly said what obviously he did say. And instead he praised Zelenskyy. He says that we get along. He's the greatest Ukrainian president that there's ever been. So what's the moral of the story? At this point in time, Ukrainian relations with the United States look pretty good. A week ago, they looked dreadful. And given Trump's mercurial personality, the question before us and before him and Ukraine is, what will these relations look like a week from now? It's conceivable that they'll change once again. Now, possibly, probably not, because after all, they did sign, or they will be signing this document, which obligates both the Americans and the Ukrainians to certain forms of behavior. But you never know with Trump. Now that he denies having called Zelenskyy a dictator, even though there's ample evidence of that, the only conclusion we can draw safely is that anything is possible. What's interesting about the current document as well, two more interesting points. While the United States does not want to provide security guarantees, Trump and the Ukrainians recognize that if American investors come into Ukraine to dig up these rare earth minerals, they will be protected by American soldiers. Not Ukraine, but they will be protected. But technically, if you think about it, that's sort of like protecting Ukraine, or at least a part of Ukraine, one of the most vulnerable parts of Ukraine. So while there's no security guarantee, there is the implication that if things were to get complicated in these territories, the United States would protect at least its own investments. And we know from a sad page in American history, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, with regard to Central and Latin America, that the United States has frequently intervened militarily, not in defense of the countries, but in defense of their own investments and in defense of their commercial interests, which comes out to be the equivalent of defending the country. So there's that. The other important point is that the deal between Washington and Kiev regarding rare earth metals has been apparently closed. Again, we don't know for sure, but let's assume that's the case. Right after Putin in Russia suggested that the United States sign a deal with Russia. Now, is this a snub? Does this mean that Trump is sending a message to Putin? Or is it just business as usual? We don't know, but it could be. It could be an indication of the fact that Trump is trying to be somewhat more even-handed in his approach to the region. But again, given Trump's personality, everything is possible and we simply don't know.
Dr. Motyl, I want to go back to the question on Zelenskyy and also regarding the tension to join NATO. I mean, again, during various occasions, let the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy expressed that he refused to accept the peace deal imposed on Ukraine if Kiev has no role in crafting it. And again, he even willing to sacrifice his presidency for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO. But right now, given the fact that Ukraine and also the Zelenskyy is dealing with Donald Trump a wild card, how much is the sacrifice for Ukraine not to be part of the NATO? And also, if we trace back a couple weeks ago, Zelenskyy openly expressed, without being part of the NATO, it's rather dangerous for any other countries in NATO to be invaded by Putin. So again, putting everything together, how much is the sacrifice and how can we understand the complication for Ukraine not to be part of the NATO? What is the difficulties, or in addition to Donald Trump's rhetoric?
Well, unfortunately, being a member of NATO is no guarantee of security. And the members of NATO, especially the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, know that even though, I mean, in case of an attack by Russia, ostensibly Article 5 is supposed to be invoked, which says that member states would consider an attack on one of their members as an attack on themselves. But at the same time, that very same article says the choice of responding and how to respond to the attack would be up to the individual country. So there is no guarantee that an attack, an aggression on, say, Estonia would require that Germany, France, the UK, or America respond militarily. So in that sense, membership in NATO is a good thing because it raises doubts in the minds of Putin. You never know. Maybe they will respond. But there's no guarantee. So while it's absolutely valid for Zelenskyy to want Ukraine to be in NATO, I think for a variety of other political and some military reasons, ultimately it's not a security guarantee. All the more so since Trump seems determined not to get involved militarily, and he wants the Europeans to take the burden of security for Ukraine. He's also made it clear that if they were to be attacked, it's not clear that the United States would come to their assistance. So it's, again, NATO is a good thing, but maybe not such a good thing as it's often touted as being. There are also alternatives, that's the point, because of the hostile language by Vance, Hegseth, and Trump vis-a-vis the Europeans and vis-a-vis NATO. And we saw this at the Munich conference 2 weeks ago. The Europeans have realized that they need to do more for their security, their own security, and to do more for Ukraine's security. So they're now in the process of crafting a huge, like hundreds of billions of dollars military security program that would enhance their capacity to protect themselves and to protect Ukraine. And that's important. There's even been talk by the German Merz, he's likely to be the next chancellor, that Europe should think about an alternative to NATO. And remember, one of the additional problem with NATO is that in order to become a member, all of the member countries have to vote for your membership. So in other words, it has to be unanimous. And Hungary and Slovakia, as well as the United States, have already said they won't support Ukraine's membership. So how do you deal with that? In any case, an alternative security arrangement, which obviously won't emerge overnight, but the steps to it could be taken, could exclude countries that simply have no interest in protecting Europe, that are pro-Russian and have no interest in protecting Ukraine. So Ukraine has additional cards up its sleeve. It's not quite as vulnerable as it's often presented as being. In terms of weapons, for instance, 55% of the weapons that Ukraine uses are produced by Ukraine in Ukraine.
Mm.
Europe provides about 25%, and the Americans provide about 20%. So it's not inconceivable that that 20% could be met in other ways. Now, of course, it depends on the kind of weapons, and the Americans provide Patriot missiles. But the good news is, or at least potentially good news is that Trump has said recently, and within the last 2 days, that he would likely continue to support Ukraine militarily. Now, again, we don't know what that means because it's Trump again, but at least he seems to be saying the right things. So that may be a meaningful shift in American policy towards Ukraine.
Dr. Motyl, I want to put the war in Ukraine in this global perspective. Some believe that because we know this unpredictability of Donald Trump and also including his going back and forth, the political rhetoric on Ukraine and also on Russia, more international political scientists believe that Donald Trump is actually pushing or simultaneously creating this what we called international alignment. And of course, that when we talk about alignment, that includes some of the critical countries that you and I we discussed before. For example, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And also there's another name, it's called the axis of upheaval. Now, from your perspective, we are looking at the deal that Donald Trump is trying to settle down between Ukraine and Russia. But meanwhile, we know that when we look at the names such as China, such as North Korea and Russia, they are, Iran, they're all supporting Russia at the same time, especially the North Korean government. I mean, again, based on the report that the second wave of North Korean soldiers arrived at the front line, and clearly the North Korean government did not understand what's in for them or what can they expect. So, but from your perspective, how much do we believe that Donald Trump is actually creating this what we called the axis of upheaval or this political alignment for China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia? And how do you think that particularly from the US and also from the NATO perspective, able to understand and be prepared for what's unexpected for the long run? What do you think?
Well, this is, again, a very good question. One of the possible motives for Trump's warm relations with Russia, and this was articulated by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, 1 or 2 days ago, may be, and again, we don't know for sure, but one of the motives may be to establish closer relations with Russia so as to move Russia from China. When Rubio said this, the Russians, and especially the Chinese, immediately said, no, our relations are as tight as ever, and they're going to remain this way forever. Well, that may be true, or not necessarily. It all depends, obviously, on circumstances. But imagine that Trump could somehow make a deal, a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine that is more or less favorable to both sides. I don't think that's going to happen personally, but let's assume that happens. Then the question becomes, won't Russia feel some degree of sympathy for Trump and for the United States? And might it not be willing then to loosen its ties with China? Because after all, its relations with China are those of essentially a mineral resource colony for a much stronger country. But Russia could be on more or less equal terms with Europe, if not necessarily with the United States. So that might be something that Trump is pursuing. Again, it's hard, since we don't know what he's thinking, and even when we can see what he's thinking, we still don't know what he's thinking. It's hard to judge what exactly the game plan here is. But it might be something like that. If that were to happen, it would be significant because then essentially this axis that you were referring to would consist of North Korea, China, and Iran, which essentially means it's just China. Because North Korea and Iran would be significantly weaker partners. And that would also lead to an upheaval in this alignment that you've been talking about. But everything hinges on Putin. I mean, this is something we've talked about before. The Russians today said that they would not accept a ceasefire along the current line of engagement. And the reason for that is because they annexed 4 Ukrainian provinces in their entirety, officially annexed them 2 years ago, but they only occupy about 2/3 of these provinces. So from the Russian point of view, it's Ukraine that is illegally occupying their territory and not Russia that is illegally occupying Ukrainian territory. I see no way in which that claim can be reduced, can be eliminated by the Russians, unless, of course, they're forced to accept a ceasefire along the current line of engagement. But otherwise, Putin has invested too much in the war to be able to suddenly say, oh, sure, we annex these territories, but we don't really mean it. Not when close to 1 million soldiers have been killed and wounded. So that's the dilemma that Trump is facing. And interestingly, yesterday in a press conference, he said, the war will either end quickly or maybe not at all. And suddenly it seems to be the case that he's realizing that you're not going to be able to solve this problem in 24 hours. Now, again, I do think there is a solution, but it's not going to be an easy one. That's the point.
Dr. Motyl, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. I mean, again, we've been talking about Ukraine for the entire conversation, and we know the clock is ticking for Ukraine. Again, as you mentioned before, the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy is expected to visit the White House today as you and I were speaking. And again, we don't know the details at this moment. But meanwhile, I still want to ask the question on Putin. Some believe that Putin also doesn't have a lot of time to wait for Ukraine to collapse or for the Western support to wither away. So from your perspective, at this moment, and we know that Donald Trump's patience is running out, again, regarding the support to Ukraine and also the war. But meanwhile, from your perspective, how do we assess the patience level from Putin? I mean, again, he knows that this is a very dangerous game, despite the fact that he received support from the North Korean government, from China, and also from Iran, all those countries. But at the same time, the sanctions are still not been lifted, and also that he's facing political obstacles back and forth. So, based on everything we talk about, the final question: is time also running out for Putin as well? Your final thoughts.
And the answer to that, quite simply, is absolutely. If you look at Putin's economy, it's largely a militarized economy. The consumer sector isn't growing. It's actually it's experiencing negative growth. Inflation is high. They're running out of reserves. Unemployment is relatively low, but that's because they have a labor shortage. And again, respectable economists, both in the West and those who are in Russia or in opposition to Putin, essentially say that 2025 may be a catastrophic economic year, quote unquote. That's the term they use, a catastrophic economic year for Putin. At the same time, if you look at the battlefield, the Russians are making very, very small advances while losing somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers every single day. That's unsustainable because that comes out to about 40,000 soldiers in the course of a month. And they're simply not able to recruit that many soldiers on a monthly basis. So Putin is running out of time. And the reason he's so involved and so ostensibly committed to achieving a peaceful settlement has nothing to do with his peaceful intentions, because they're not. It has a lot to do with the desperation. He knows that if the war continues for another half year, not only will the economy and the military get worse, but Russia could actually experience a breakdown economically and conceivably even a breakdown on the front. So he needs some kind of deal, much more so than Trump. And he actually needs a deal even more so than the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians ultimately are in this struggle in order to survive, and they will do everything necessary in order to survive and to continue to exist. The Russians, in contrast, don't need the war. They could just as easily live without it. So Putin is in a box. He's in trouble, and Russia is in trouble. And the implications of that for Trump are simple. He has the far stronger cards. Rather than giving away his cards to Putin, he should be negotiating a very hard deal, making demands, forcing Putin to comply, because Putin really has no alternative. He is desperate, and Russia is desperate for some kind of end to the war.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, I agree with you 100%. Even though at this moment that we're seeing this confusing and also this complicated rhetoric from Donald Trump, and also we're hoping that some sort of reasonable settlement can be brought to the table for both Russia and Ukraine. Again, Dr. Motyl, at the end of the day, that we should not see the continuation of the war, and we should not see the devastation and the sacrifice of the people in both countries. And most importantly is the energy and resources that actually, again, it's better for the future. It would never be good for the war and also for Russia and Ukraine. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and USSR. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out his amazing books, and especially this one called Why Empires Reemerge, Imperial Collapse and Imperial Revival in a Comparative Perspective. Well, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. Again, hopefully next time when we have the conversation, we no longer talk about the war in Ukraine, but instead we can talk about something beyond this war. So thank you so much for doing this.
I quite agree. Thank you for having me, Will. Take care. My best to you and to all your listeners.